recruiter. The smartest way to hire. All right. My guest today is a sleep doctor. And I said at the beginning of this podcast, this is a fucking good one. This one, I knew about the importance of sleep. I knew it was huge. But I know way more now. And I'm stunned. I mean, I'm going to shut the fuck up and introduce our guest, Dr. Matthew Walker.
Joe Rogan Podcast, check it out.
The Joe Rogan Experience.
Train by day, Joe Rogan Podcast by night, all day.
And we're live. What's going on? Did you sleep well last night?
I did. I didn't sleep too badly. I mean, hotels are a tough thing. And we actually know the science that one half of your brain will actually not sleep as deeply than the other when you're sleeping in an unusual room like a hotel room.
Really? That's what fucks me up. Because when I'm on the road, you know, I'll do 3 different hotels in a week. Because I'll do like a Thursday, Friday, Saturday, like with gigs. And then by the time Sunday rolls around, I'm a mess.
In rough shape.
Yeah, is that what it is?
Yeah, and it's a threat detection thing. That it's much more than we can. So dolphins on any sort of sea-dwelling mammal can actually sleep with half a brain. So one half of their brain goes into deep sleep, the other half is wide awake.
That's how people at the DMV do it. Those people that work at the Department of Motor Vehicles, they work half asleep. You ever meet them?
I haven't, no.
Just teasing you.
I will.
DMV listening, going, "Fuck you, man! Next time you come in to get your license renewed."
That's my next NIH grant, I think. Looking at the DMV and sleep. But yeah,
TSA workers, same thing. Same type of human.
That I've come across.
It's them too. I'm just kidding, fuckers. Relax. So when you're in a hotel room, what is happening that your half the brain is not really sleeping?
Yeah, so there's different stages of sleep. There are 2 principal non-REM sleep, REM sleep. The other is REM sleep, which is also known as dream sleep.
Right.
And non-rapid eye movement sleep is further divided into 4 separate stages, which are unimaginatively called stages 1 through 4. We're a creative bunch. It is true, but I think it's also our low IQ. But it's the deep stages of sleep 3 and 4 of that non-rapid eye movement. That's where a lot of sort of body replenishment takes place. That's metabolism, all of those good things. But that's the deep sleep that one part of your brain will resist going into.
Time to show off. Here goes nothing. Come on, you see that? Damn it! Good stuff. Oh man, I should try this with my eyes closed. I own this city, baby. There we go. Yeah, let's do this. Damn, my bad. Great. star coming through. Hell of a performance, if I may say so.
There is a kind of an acute version where the alcohol is swirling around in your system, and after about 6 hours, your liver have finally excreted all of the alcohol, and your brain has been deprived of dream sleep for that first 6 hours. It feasts in the last couple of hours, and that's why you have these really bizarre dreams after you've been drinking a little bit too much.
Oh, wow. So, what is happening with marijuana, though, specifically? Do you know?
Yeah, so marijuana, it does help people, it puts people to sleep quicker, although I think the question is whether it's really naturalistic sleep or not that they go into. Certainly with alcohol it's not. That nightcap idea is a misnomer. Alcohol will actually, it's a form of drugs that we call sedatives. Sedation is not sleep, it's very different, but we often mistake one for the other. Marijuana, it seems to act in a physiologically very different way to target the same receptors in the brain. So it's unclear whether this speed with which you fall asleep after having a session with marijuana is actually natural sleep. Let's assume it is. The problem, however, is that it then will start to disrupt REM sleep. It will start to block the process. We think perhaps at the level of the brainstem, which is where these two types of sleep, non-REM and REM sleep, will actually get sort of worked out. That's where marijuana may actually impact dream sleep and shut it down or block it.
Have there been any studies on chronic marijuana smokers, like Don the Duck type character?
So what, their brain goes into deep sleep, the other half is wide awake.
Half asleep. You ever meet him?
I haven't, no, but I will,
listening to him. Fuck you, man. Next time you come in here, you're less than 3 noon.
There's my next NIH friend that they actually get me in sleep. But yeah,
Here we go. Keep it going, man. All right, showtime. Nice. Look, Mom, no hiders. There we go.
For me, it fills in the blanks of like sense and that oceanized garment. Did you sleep well last night?
I did. I didn't sleep too badly. I mean, hotels are
I have got to be setting a record or something. Keep the focus, Mac. You're killing it. Form, baby. Woo! Oh, come on. All like
in a
me.
hotel room, what is happening that half your brain is not really sleeping?
Yeah, so there's different stages of sleep. There are two principal types. One is non-rapid eye movement sleep, or non-REM sleep. The other is REM sleep, which is also known as dream sleep.
Right.
And non-rapid eye movement sleep is further divided into 4 separate stages, which are unimaginatively called stages 1 through 4. We're a creative bunch as
easy to
sleep
remember.
researchers. It is true, but I think it's also on low IQ. But it's the deep stages of sleep 3 and 4 of that non-rapid eye movement. That's where a lot of sort of body replenishment takes place, great for the cardiovascular system, metabolism, all of those good things. But that's the deep sleep that one half of your brain will resist going into when you're sleeping in a foreign environment. So it stays in this kind of lighter stage, almost like a threat detection system.
Right.
And you can imagine why. It's an unusual context. Evolutionarily, it would make a lot of sense to just have that sort of on guard one half of the brain.
That makes so much sense, and that really, for me, fills in the blanks of like why, even if I get 7-8 hours sleep on the road, I'm still kind of just out of it.
Yeah, and that's in fact probably one of the most impressive parts of new research on sleep. It's not just about quantity, it's also about quality. And quality can be as detrimental if you don't get it as a reduction in total quality. I mean, both are essential.
Right.
But I think it speaks exactly to your point. You just don't feel like it's a refreshing sort of deep sleep.
Yeah, it feels totally different. It feels like, I guess I would say it feels like half asleep.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really kind of how it does feel.
Yeah.
One of the things that I noticed, I did this thing with my friends called Sober October, where we didn't smoke any pot or do no drinking at all, nothing for a month. And when I did it, one of the things I found was that after about, I don't know how many days, but it was noticeable that I would have these incredibly vivid dreams. And then I had read that marijuana does something to suppress heavy REM sleep. Like what is happening there?
Yeah, so both of those chemicals, both of which are used as a sleep aid, alcohol and marijuana, dream sleep and rapid eye movement sleep. And so what happens is that the brain is quite clever in this regard. It builds up a counter of how much dream sleep you should have had but have not been getting. And it starts to develop this increasing appetite and hunger for dream sleep. So that finally, when the alcohol actually gets out of your system, Sober October, love the name, that's all of a sudden where you get what's called a REM sleep rebound effect, where you not only get the normal amount of REM sleep that you would normally have, you get that, plus the brain tries to get back some of that dream sleep that it's been losing over the past maybe 11 months. So you get this...
Try 20 years.
Yeah, I didn't want to make any assumptions. So you get this REM sleep rebounded effect, and that's where you have these really intense dream sleep situations.
Yeah.
It's the same reason that they'll say, look, I had a bit too much to drink last night, maybe it was a Friday or Saturday, they sleep in late, they say, I just had these crazy dreams. What happens there is a kind of an acute version where the alcohol is swilling around in your system, and after about 6 hours, your liver and your kidneys have finally excreted all of the alcohol, and your brain has been deprived of dream sleep for that first 6 hours. So then it feasts in the last couple of hours, and that's why you have these really bizarre dreams after you've been drinking a little bit too much.
Oh, wow. So what is happening with marijuana, though, specifically? Do you know?
Yeah, so marijuana, it does help people, it puts people to sleep quicker, although I think the question is whether it's really realistic sleep or not that they go into. Certainly with alcohol it's not. That nightcap idea is a misnomer. Alcohol will actually, it's a form of drugs that we call sedatives. Sedation is not sleep, it's very different, but we often mistake one for the other. Marijuana, it seems to act in a physiologically very different way. It doesn't target the same receptors in the brain. So it's unclear whether this speed with which you fall asleep after having a session with marijuana is actually natural sleep. Let's assume it is. You will start to block the process. We think perhaps at the level of the brainstem, which is where these two types of sleep, REM sleep, will actually get sort of worked out. That's when marijuana may actually impact your sleep and shut it down and block it.
Have there been any studies on chronic marijuana smokers, like those Dawn to Dusk type characters that are just they're constantly high, and what happens to their brain?
Let's go. Yeah. Good. Keep it going, man. I could hit these angles all day. Eyes on the prize match. Crap. All right. Yeah, this is Unit 23. We have someone out here who's very... That better buff out. Can't stop, won't stop. I'm on fire. There goes my finesse. There we go.
She ran this thing called Moab 240.
I am the king.
It's 238 miles through the Moab Mountains, and she did it 22 miles faster than the second place man. So she won it by like a whopping, I think it was 10 hours? 10 hours ahead of the second place winner. And she slept 1 minute. 1 minute the entire time. She tried to lie. This is over 3 days. I think it took her less than 3 days. I think it took her like 2 days. She slept for 1 minute during the entire time. She tried to lie down. She said she laid down for a few minutes, but she couldn't fall asleep. And then she wound up actually just taking 1 minute and going to sleep. And she said that 1 minute was like one of the most intense, restful minutes. After that minute was over, she was woken up. She told her partner, her running partner, to wake her up in a minute. And she's like, "How long did you let me sleep?" And he was like, 1 minute. She's like, "Wow, I feel great. Let's go." And she was saying that she hallucinates, and then she started seeing like rabbits are talking to her, and she sees things that aren't there, and like mystical beings and stuff. She said it's really freaky, but she knows that she's hallucinating because she's done this. She's done a bunch of ultra marathons, so she just keeps going. She just keeps going. She's like saying hi to rabbits. They're talking to her and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, and you see these reports too. I mean, there's just going to go from the East Coast to the West Coast in as short a time as possible, and that's exactly what they do too. It's all about managing how little sleep you get, and they will explain these wild hallucinogenic experiences on the bike. If you look at world records for people who have tried to sort of go without sleep,
Time to show it. Keep it going, man. Woo! I am on fire. Nice, nice. This just keeps getting sweeter. Playtime's over. Probably one of my best runs in a while. Woo, here we go. I own this city, baby. Excuse me, superstar coming through. Whoops. Playtime's over.
Shut off.
The
So it's
king
almost
is
as
here,
though, you know,
baby.
the prison guards are gone and everyone runs amok because there's no controller, you know, in place. And so we know from the patterns of brain activity why you become sort of so visual, you see things, why you have motor kinesthetic activity, why things feel so emotional, but also why things are utterly illogical and irrational. Because your frontal brain, the thing that makes us most human, you can say goodbye to that for the rest of dream sleep.
So there's no driver.
So there's no driver. Yeah.
Now, why do we forget? Why do we forget those dreams? Because I wake up and I am sure that I'm going to remember these dreams. And sometimes I do. Sometimes I remember, and I don't think I really remember them. I think what it is very much like, you ever hear someone talk about a memory from a long time ago? I used to think that people actually remember things from a long time ago, but now what I think is they remember remembering it. They never remember talking about it, or how they described it, and then they sort of and repeat it, and in their mind convince themselves that that's what happened. Because I've heard people tell stories about the past, and they vary wildly from what is absolutely true. Like factual, you could check it, you could research it, you know what the facts are. But in their mind, it's very different. And I think that it's entirely possible that what people are doing is remembering the recollection of these memories and how they told them. And then also sort of people elaborate things and makes themselves look better or makes the situation look more dramatic. But with dreams, that doesn't make any sense. So I'm always trying to figure out, like, what is it about a dream where sometimes I can remember the dream, and sometimes it's so vivid when I wake up. I'm like, holy shit, that was crazy. What a dream. And then I forget it 20 minutes later.
Right.
What is that?
So firstly, I mean, one theory of dreaming is that it's just simply a reconstruction when you wake up. So you have these fragments of activity, and what your cortex does when it wakes up is what your cortex is designed to do when you're awake normally, which is try to package everything and make a good story, make logical fit out of the world. That's one theory. I don't believe that, though. Your point is a really interesting one. Do I remember my dreams? That doesn't necessarily mean I forget my dreams. And what I mean by that is accessibility versus availability. So have you ever had that experience where You've woken up, you thought, I was definitely dreaming, I can't quite grab it, and it's gone. And then 2 days later, you're in the shower, you're sort of washing yourself, you see a bottle of shampoo, you see the label, and it just triggers the unlocking of that dream memory, and it sort of comes flooding back. Or someone says something to you, and you think, oh, that was the dream.
Yeah.
What that tells me as a brain scientist is that the memory is there, it's preserved, it's available. But what happens most of the time when we wake up is that we lose the IP address to the memory. So it's present, but it's not consciously accessible. Available, not accessible. If that's true, what it means is that this type of information we know can have non-conscious impacts on our behavior all the time. There's great brain science about this non-conscious memory processing. It's possible that we store every one of our dreams. We just don't consciously have accessibility to it, but nevertheless it's changing how we behave, how we feel each and every day. No evidence for it. It's a theory I'm still wanting to test, but that's possible too, and it's only that anecdote where I can think, I just don't remember the dream, I've forgotten it. I don't think that may be true. It may still be there. I just need to find the keys to sort of access that memory.
What's stunning to me is how quickly the dream evaporates, the memory of the dream. In relation to past experience, like if we were outside and we saw somebody whoa, you would remember that. And then you'd be able to tell your friends, like, yeah, some lady just randomly walked past some guy and kicked him in the balls. And you remember it 10 minutes later, you remember it an hour, you remember it the next day. You remember it to your friends, yeah, it's just I remember it like a dream. And somehow or another you fit in the room, but the room got bigger, and you have these crazy dreams, and then 20 minutes later you forget all of it. Like, what is happening there?
So one current explanation is that the chemistry of the brain when you go into dream sleep is radically different.
Yeah.
So one of the chemicals called noradrenaline in the brain, which downstairs in the body, its sister chemical is called adrenaline. Noradrenaline actually plummets to the lowest levels. It's a stress chemical in the brain. It's one of them that gets shut off during dream sleep, which is
even if you're panicking. Like, what if you fall off a building?
Well, what's interesting is that chemical is low whilst you're having that dream, but when you wake up from those, and some people often wake up, that's when you have the spike of noradrenaline. So it's still low when you're in dream sleep. But there's another chemical that goes in the opposite direction. It's called acetylcholine. It's the chemical that is actually altered in Alzheimer's disease. And these two chemicals will change essentially the input-output direction of information flow into the memory centers of the brain.
That makes sense because people take that as a neutral. To enhance memory, especially verbal memory and recollection of words and things like that.
That's right.
So that's happening while you're sleeping.
Well, so you're in REM sleep, yeah. But what may be happening, our current models, if you sort of build these neural models to sort of mimic dreaming, it may be that during dreaming, it's principally about the outflow of information to generate dreams. And in fact, the chemical profile is oppositional to input, which is about saving. So it's about sort of pumping out information rather than creating information. And so when you come out of dream sleep, you still get this sort of lingering after sort of taste of chemistry, as it were, in the brain. That means that the dreaming brain is more programmed to be outputting a narrative and an experience rather than actually committing it to memory, which is the opposite direction, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. How aware are you of dimethyltryptamine?
I'm somewhat aware of it scientifically, not personally.
Experientially.
Yeah.
One of the things about the psychedelic experiences with dimethyltryptamine, first of all, it's endogenous. Your brain produces it, your lungs, your liver produce it. But when you have a DMT experience, after it's over, the memory fades very rapidly. And it seems just like a dream in that regard, where while you're having it, what's bizarre is that you're having it while you're awake.
Yeah.
And then after you have it, within 10, 20 minutes, it is just like a dream that you can't remember. I remember like little flashes of experiences that I've had. And there's been a lot of speculation that that's one of the things that you're experiencing while you're in heavy REM sleep, and that could be responsible for the crazy visuals that you have that seem so vivid. I mean, there's been times where I've had dreams where I was 100% convinced that I was awake.
Yeah.
And then something happened. Like, I do this thing sometimes where and if I do it consciously a lot, I think I saw in one of those wacky movies, like What the Bleep Do Me Know. I think I saw it in that. When you walk up to a door, as you're walking through the door, you knock on the side of the door and go, "Am I awake?" Nope, I'm not awake. Or am I asleep, rather?
Yeah.
No, I'm not asleep. Because I'm knocking on the door. Well, I did that, and my hand was like going right through the wall. And I went, "Oh, I'm sleeping." And then I woke up, and there was like, "Ooh." But the feeling that I had while I was in that dream, it was so real. Everything seemed so real. Like, what could possibly be causing me to construct this artificial reality in my mind that, at the moment at least, was indistinguishable from the reality that I experience right now? And I'm assuming, because I just knocked on this table, that I'm awake.
Yeah, I really hope I'm not just a fictive character in your dreamscape.
Well, maybe we're sharing a dream.
Yeah, very Inception-like.
Is that possible?
Not based on the science so far. But I think what you're speaking about there really is almost why would Mother Nature create this thing called the dream experience? What would be the function of essentially every night going into what sums up to be about 2 total hours of virtual reality experience and testing? One possibility, which is deeply unsatisfying, is that it's just a byproduct, it's just epiphenomenal, that when your brain goes into this thing called REM sleep and all of the different patterns of brain activity that we described, an offshoot is this thing that we call dreaming. In the same way that a light bulb, the reason that we construct the apparatus that it's effective is to produce light, but when you produce light in that way, you also produce heat. It was never the function of the light bulb, it's just what happens when you produce light in that way. Maybe dreaming is just sort of the heat of REM sleep, and REM sleep serves lots of other functions, but that doesn't feel to me right, though.
Why?
Well, firstly, I think it's probably additionally metabolically demanding to have dreams in addition to this thing called REM sleep. And whenever Mother Nature burns calories, it's usually for a reason, because they're so precious.
That's a good point. That makes sense, too. Yeah. I read some article about the lack of REM sleep with marijuana users, and it was trying to say, and it made me super skeptical even as a pot smoker, it was trying to say that it's not bad for you because what it's essentially doing is bypassing the REM sleep and going directly into the deep sleep, and it's helping you in that regard. Does that make sense to you?
Doesn't make sense.
As a neuroscientist, he says, "Nay, you fucking stoners."
I'm so deeply unpopular. I'm telling people,
No.
don't smoke pot, stay away from alcohol. Apart from a general personality which is dislikable, this doesn't help me.
You're definitely not dislikable, but I don't think you're saying anything wrong. I think marijuana, like most things, is best used in moderation. And one thing that I got out of the Sober October thing wasn't just that it's fascinating to see the dreams like just ramp up and get crazy, but also that when you take a few days off and then smoke a little pot actually has more impact. In fact, one of my favorite psychedelic authors and lecturers, the late great Terence McKenna, his advice was to not do marijuana for long periods of time and then do as much as you could stand. And he was a real psychedelic adventurer, and his thought was to really get the benefit out of marijuana, it's not something that should be used daily and recreationally. It should be used as a psychedelic sacrament. Not should be, because he actually did smoke pot pretty regularly, rather. But his thought was, if you really let the full impact of it, you shouldn't be accustomed to it. And when you're accustomed to it, you build up a tolerance to it. It doesn't have the same impact. Like, it's that thing, I don't know if you've ever been around pot smokers, but when someone doesn't smoke pot and then they get talked into smoking pot with some pot smokers, it's always a terrible idea. Because you got a bunch of people with super high tolerances and some poor person that doesn't have any tolerance, and they just get taken down in a tornado rabbit hole. It's like so paranoid, thinking about everything, freaking out, all these sensations that we've never experienced before. But my idea that you can bypass REM sleep
ever made. And that counts for all of the stages of sleep too. Again, Mother Nature wouldn't waste time putting you into a state that wasn't necessary. And what we've discovered is that all of those different stages of sleep that we spoke about all have unique and separate functions. So you can't shortchange any one of them. You know, you don't need to bias towards one and try and sort of, placate the other. Evolution has taken a long time to get the blueprint accurately correct for each physiological individual. I wouldn't play around with it and think that you're smarter than that process.
Right. I when I read it, I felt like it was a justification for smoking a lot of pot. Like, man, you're just getting deeper sleep, man. You don't need that REM sleep. You're passing it up, man. You just go right into the deep, heavy, necessary sleep.
Au contraire.
Au contraire, potheads. So what is happening to the body? One
dreaming at that point, or did you just have no recollection of anything going on at that point?
I believe I had a recollection. It's been a long time, but I believe I had a recollection. Like I would be like in bed with my girlfriend. I'd wake her up too, because I'd just jolt. Like I wouldn't throw a full kick, but my body would move like I was going to. Like I would turn my hips and my leg would extend. My body was. I attribute it to the idea that it's so extreme, like the activity of fighting is so extreme that my brain had kind of like hypercharged itself to compete at this very high level, and that this was like so unusual that it was almost at red alert all the time, and maybe even trying to work out patterns while I was sleeping.
That's exactly the evidence that we have now. So for things like motor skills, or even rats running around a maze where they will learn specific sort of, navigational pathways and even skilled motor movements, what you can do is you can place these electrodes into centers of the brain. We work, my sleep center works on humans, but other people have done these studies in rats. And you implant electrodes and you measure the brain cells firing as the rat is running around the maze. And let's say that you can sort of play little tones for each brain cell. So they're running around the maze, and you can listen to the brain cells learning the signature of that maze. So it goes bum-bum-bum-bum, bum-bum-bum-bum, bum-bum-bum-bum. What was amazing is that when you let those rats sleep, but you keep listening to the brain, what you hear is brum, 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 as if the brain is actually, and in fact it is, it's replaying the exact same sequence, the memory sequence that it was learning whilst it was awake. It's replaying, but at a speed that is 20 times faster.
Whoa!
So, you know, now we start to get into this inception world, and I don't mean to, because the scientific data, we're not sort of in that territory, but, you know, that notion of time compression and time dilation that Christopher Nolan played so well with in that movie, we can see that at the level of brain cell firing in rats as they're learning these mazes. And it comes back to what you're saying, which is that the better that they rehearse those skilled memories, when you wake them up and test them the next day, that predicts how much better they are in terms of their performance. So it's not just that you learn, you go to sleep, and you replay and you hit the save button on these new memories. You actually sculpt out those memories and you improve them. And we've done studies with motor skill learning, critical for athletic performance. And practice does not make perfect. Practice with a night of sleep is what makes perfect, because you come back the next day and you're 20 to 30% better in terms of your skilled performance than where you were at the end of your practice session the day before.
Wow! Wow!
I mean, sleep is the greatest legal performance enhancing drug that most people are probably neglecting in sport.
Wow! And not just for your physical performance, but actually skill learning.
That's right. Skill learning, memory, and then also, you know, downstairs in the body, all of the recuperative benefits. And you can flip the coin, by the way. If you're getting 6 hours of sleep or less, your time to physical exhaustion drops by up to 30%. So you could spend all of your time training for a 10-round fight, perfect condition, but then I put you on 6 hours of sleep the night before. You're now going to be physically exhausted by round 7 rather than round 10.
Wow. But, well, that's a really hard thing for fighters, because they have a very difficult time sleeping the night before a big fight.
Yep.
It's very, very difficult.
Hugely problematic.
Anxiety and
Yep.
And I would imagine it's got to be, I mean, it's probably going to take a huge toll on them. There's probably be a huge benefit if they could somehow or another bypass all that and just relax and learn how to relax and learn how to actually sleep.
I mean, I think, you know, it's one of, we're constantly trying to hack the physiological system, especially in elite sports these days, because, you know, small fractions of a percent of gain can make a huge difference.
Well, that sounds like 30%. That's a monster.
Huge, yeah. I mean, your time to, sort of not just physical exhaustion, but, you know, the lactic acid builds up quicker the less and less that you sleep. Your ability of the lungs to actually expire carbon dioxide and inhale oxygen decreases the less sleep that you have.
That makes so much sense. Wow, because when I was doing Fear Factor, and I was doing stand-up comedy, and then I was also doing another television show, and I was doing jiu-jitsu. I never got 8 hours sleep. Mostly got 4. Usually got 4. And my cardio always sucked.
Yeah.
It was always terrible. And I'm like, eventually my alarm went off at 8. So my sleep was at 8. Just didn't have any extra gear. I was like, ugh. I did it, I pushed through it, but then it was over. I was like, oh. Well, last night I slept 7.5 hours. Woke up today, lifted weights, ran, felt great, feel great now. Like 2 days in difference. I mean, that's the difference. The difference is one day I got real sleep, one day I didn't. I did the exact same thing, even more today. I lifted weights today as well, and I just feel great. So I could see it physiologically in the difference in my performance in 24 hours.
Yeah, and that's noticeable. I mean, we see that too. You know, your peak muscle strength, your physical vertical jump height, and your peak running speed, all of those things correlate with sleep. The less sleep you have, the worse.
Nighttime, my time.
joke. That's fascinating that Einstein figured that out too. That he literally had like a whole team that he would drop this ball, would hit it, bang, wake up and start writing. Like, imagine being in the room. I would love to be in the room watching Einstein do that. It must have been fascinating.
Oh, sorry, I said Einstein. It's Edison.
Wasn't Edison a thief though? Didn't he steal everything from Tesla?
I think there's
Still a lot of
arguments to be
shit.
made, but I mean, he has a lot to answer for, by the way, in terms of the way that we're sleeping.
I got this.
I think it's a giant shift in perspective. Telescopes, but you go to visitor center. Visitor center, they have some telescopes set up, but it's you actually drive through the clouds. So as you're driving up this mountain, we were bummed out. We're like, oh, it's cloudy, we might not be able to see anything. And then you drive through the clouds, and then when you get through the clouds, you're like, holy shit! And you feel like you're on a spaceship flying through space, and this is what our ancestors saw. They saw the way like this. And the way the Big Island has set up, they use diffused lighting all over the island because of the Keck Observatory. So you don't have the same level of light pollution that you have when you're in a normal city like Los Angeles, which is terrible. I mean, LA, if you look, I see like 1 or 2 stars because everything's lit up. It's crazy bright. I think that perspective that's a giant factor in the way human beings look at their relationship with the universe. But I think that also just the light everywhere, constant light everywhere, it's got to be a big factor in why people sleep so little, right?
Yeah, we know it is now. I mean, these studies have been done. You know, the first part is the external light, which is, you know, street lighting. You know, even if you've got curtains, that can still bleed through.
Yeah.
But then when you come into the home, you know, the invasion of light into the home by way of technology has been a big problem.
People looking at their phones before they go to bed.
Well, firstly, yeah, I mean, the incandescent light bulb was the start of it. And light bulbs can suppress a hormone that's called melatonin, the hormone of darkness, and it tells your brain when it's dark and when it's time to sleep. But then you add into that screen usage, and big studies were, for example, 1 hour of iPad reading versus just 1 hour of reading on a book, you know, in dim light. That 1 hour of iPad reading firstly delayed the release of this critical darkness hormone called melatonin by about 3 hours. So if you read on your iPad for an hour here in California, your melatonin peak is not going to arrive. I mean, somewhere in Hawaii time, in fact, it's 3 hours delayed. It's 50% less in terms of its peak. And furthermore, you don't get the same amount of REM sleep, and when you wake up the next morning, you don't feel as refreshed or restored by your sleep. Those studies have been done too.
Wow. What should someone do?
Back on track, come on.
Hold yourself together, Ty. Let's get some breathing room. Keep it together.
The idea of two sleeps.
Yeah, it's actually a
Yes.
little different than the idea of two sleeps. So there was a time in sort of the Dickensian era where people would sleep for the first half of the night, maybe sort of 4 hours or so. Then they would wake up, they would socialize, they would eat, feel love, and then they would go back into the second sleep. If you look at natural biological rhythms in the brain and the body, that doesn't really seem to be how we were designed. It certainly seems to be something that we did in society, but I think it's more of a societal trend. That we were designed. Those tribes will often sleep about 6.5 hours, 7 hours of sleep at night. And then, especially in the summer, they'll have that siesta-like behavior in the afternoon. And all of us have that. Sort of this, what's called the postprandial dip in alertness, just means after lunch. And if I measure your brainwave activity with electrodes, I can see a drop in your physiological alertness somewhere between 2 to 4 p.m. in the afternoon.
But is that dependent on diet?
It's not. People think it is, especially after they've had a heavy lunch.
Yeah.
You can actually just have people fasting for long periods of time. Actually makes your sleep much worse. But you can have people abstain from lunch and you still get that drop. So it's independent of food. It's a genetically hardwired, pre-programmed drop that suggests we should be sleeping biphasically.
But is that dependent upon their standard diet? Because if someone is on a carbohydrate-rich diet, a lot of times you do get that spike,
Yeah.
and then you crash. But when people are on low-carb and high-fat diets, they don't get that, and they tend to be more even with their energy through the day.
Yeah. So yeah, that sort of more constant release of energy can actually help you sort of almost combat that lull.
But that lull exists no matter what.
Exactly.
So even if you don't think it exists, it's there.
It's still present.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So why did they do that in the Dickens era? Why did they? What is there a root cause of their double sleep thing?
We don't know. I mean, it's hard to sort of really go back.
Fascinating.
Yeah, it's incredible.
That was a trend.
Yeah, that it was a movement.
That they would just wake up and do things, and
yeah,
maybe it's because they didn't have TV. And they didn't know what to do with themselves.
Yeah. Well, sounds like they did some pretty interesting things, which were nice. But
yeah. Well, they created a lot of art then too, right? A lot of writing. And A lot of fascinating stuff came out of that time. Now, when you're measuring people's health, and when you're measuring people's health in regard to how much sleep they have, like, how do you do that? Do you just talk to people? Do you do surveys? Like, how do you get like a detailed analysis of people's patterns?
So you can do it at many different levels. I mean, we can start at the sort of gross high level, which is epidemiological studies across millions of people, where you do surveys, you ask them about their sleep, and then you look at health outcomes. The first thing from that data that's clear is an unfortunate truth. The shorter your sleep, the shorter your life.
Whoa.
Short sleep predicts all-cause mortality.
Which is really ironic, because people that want to sleep less are like, I don't have a whole lot of time. This life is short. Well,
Yeah.
It's fucking short if you sleep less.
Yeah, that old maxim, you can sleep when you're dead.
Yeah.
Well, it's mortally unwise advice, because we know from the data you will be both dead sooner, and the quality of that now shorter life will be significantly worse.
Yeah, that's counterintuitive to people. The idea that you need this, it's not just like you're making best use of time by sleeping less. You're not. You would make best use of time by being awake less.
Exactly.
Which is crazy.
I mean, wakefulness, firstly, from a brain perspective, is low-level brain damage. We know that.
Wakefulness is?
Yeah.
Low, like right now, you and I are getting low-level brain damage.
Yeah, that's right. And it's sleep that offers a reparatory function.
Wow.
And I'll give you one example, which is your risk for Alzheimer's disease. Insufficient sleep across the lifespan now seems to be one of the most significant lifestyle factors determining whether or not you will develop Alzheimer's.
What studies, or if any, have been done on people that work the third shift?
So people have looked at shift work in general. They haven't necessarily split it down to that granular point, but what we see is that shift workers have higher rates of obesity, higher rates of diabetes, but perhaps most finally cancer. And in fact, we now know the link between a lack of sleep and cancer is quite strong. Insufficient sleep is linked to cancer of the bowel, cancer of the prostate, cancer of the breast. And the association has become so powerful that recently the World Health Organization decided to classify any form of nighttime shift work as a probable carcinogen.
Whoa.
Yeah, so jobs that may induce cancer because of a disruption of your sleep-wake rhythms.
Are there other correlating factors? Like, don't people that sleep less or work into the night, don't they eat more and eat more shitty food?
They do both of those things.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we know exactly the pathways. So there are two hormones that control your appetite and your weight. One is called leptin, the other is called ghrelin. They sound like hobbits, but they're not. They're real hormone, the real chemicals.
They do sound like hobbits.
Yeah, it's bizarre, but so leptin is the chemical that tells your brain you're full, you're satiated, you don't want to eat anymore. Ghrelin does the opposite. It's the hunger hormone. It says you want to eat more, you're not satisfied with your food. If I take people, and these studies have been done, we've done some of these studies too, and you just put a group of healthy people on 4 or 5 hours of sleep for, let's say, 1 week, and you look at those two hormones, they go in unfortunately opposite directions. So leptin, that says you're full, stop eating, that gets suppressed by a lack of sleep. Ghrelin, the hunger hormone, that gets ramped up. So firstly, people who are sleeping just 5 to 6 hours a night will on average eat somewhere between 200 to 300 extra calories each day because of their underslept state. Add that up, it's about 70,000 extra calories a year. It's about 10 to 15 pounds of obese mass each year, which for me is starting to sound familiar. But what we also know is that it's not just that when you're underslept you eat more, you eat more of the wrong things. So the great scientific work, if you give people this sort of finger buffet and they can eat whatever they want and it contains all of the different food groups, and you sleep deprive them or you give them a full 8 hours of sleep, yes, they start to overeat by somewhere around about 450 calories with total sleep deprivation. But what they go after is heavy-hitting carbohydrates and simple sugars, processed food. And they stay away from the healthy sort of leafy greens, nuts, proteins, etc. So you're not just eating more, you're eating more of the wrong things. And that's why a lack of sleep has such a strong obesogenic profile to it. And you can take a step back too and you say, well, if you look at the rise of obesity over the past 70 years, it's just this upward exponential increase. And if you plot on the same graph the amount of sleep that society is getting, it goes in the opposite direction. As sleep time has declined, obesity rates have increased. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that the obesity epidemic is simply a sleep problem. It's not. It's a problem of us being sedentary, processed foods, larger food serving sizes. If you take those factors, though, by themselves, they cannot explain the increase in obesity. Other things are at play. Is sleep one of them? Now we know it is. It's a critical factor in the obesogenic epidemic.
I know from personal experience, when I'm tired, I always gravitate towards the worst choices. For me, it's late night cheeseburgers.
Yeah.
You know, Wendy's at 2 o'clock in the morning or whatever. What happens if you get naps? Like, say if you only have 5 hours of sleep, but you take a 2-hour nap during the day. Does everything make up?
Yes and no. So what you're talking about there is what we call prophylactic napping, which is sort of strategically trying to help combat your deficiency of sleep. Naps can actually give you benefits. We've done some of these studies where they improve, your learning, your memory, your alertness, your concentration, especially your emotional regulation too. Sleep is critical for emotional first aid and mental health. However, you can't keep using naps to self-medicate sort of short sleep of 4 or 5 hours each night. We know that the system itself, your brain, has no capacity to regain all of the sleep that it's lost. It will try to sleep back some of that debt, but what we've discovered, let's say I take you tonight, I deprive you of sleep, 8 hours lost, then I give you all of the recovery sleep that you want on a second, third or fourth night. You will sleep longer, but you will only get back maybe just 3 or 4 hours of that lost total 8. So sleep is not like the bank. You can't accumulate a debt and then hope to pay it off at the weekend. And so there is no credit system within the brain for sleep. You can't bank it, which is odd, by the way. I would love that system.
Then you would know what you owed.
You would know what you owed, but I could also just know when I'm going into a state of sleep debt, and I could build up some credit. And there's precedent for this, by the way. There is a system like that in the brain. It's called the fat cell, because there were times during our evolutionary past where we faced famine and we faced feast. And so the body learned to adapt to that. So when you have feast, store it up as caloric energy in these things called adipose cells, fat cells. And then when you go into famine, you can spend that caloric credit. Where is that in the brain? Why don't we have that? The reason is very simple. Human beings are the only species that deliberately deprive themselves of sleep for no apparent reason. In other words, Mother Nature has never faced the challenge of coming up with a safety net for a lack of sleep. We've never been forced to come up with that solution. That's why we get such demonstrable disease, sickness, and impairment when you undergo a lack of sleep.
So this is a recent...
There they will to stay awake.
That's fascinating. I did not know that. So fasting is when you're talking about multiple day fasting and not intermittent fasting.
We don't know the evidence for intermittent fasting. So if some people are doing sort of 12 hours, 14 hours, 16 hours, that doesn't seem to be extreme enough to trigger a change in sleep. But if you fast for these long periods, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, you can really see some quite marked sleep fragmentation. Ask any of those people, they'll tell you.
That's fascinating because people always cite the health benefits of multiple day fasts. Do you think that that's just like a placebo effect?
Certainly we know that there are chemical pathways that when you go into fasting are activated that seem to be beneficial for health outcomes. There's a big literature on sort of fasting and aging, the mTOR pathway, for example. But, we also know that as a species, we were not designed to have such terrible fragmented sleep. And we spoke about how sleep regulates your appetite.
Right.
You know, if you're trying not to eat food and sort of control and manage your weight, the last thing that you probably want to do is be shortchanging yourself on sleep, because it's only going to make you even more hungry and reach for sort of worse food. So I still think there's room for fasting in the equation, but I think those extreme fasts, have a better place on sleep. It's still yet to be understood. Play around with anything going beyond sensible, behavior.
So what does it? Like, what is, if you're going to fast for 2 days, what switches on that forces your body into this haphazard sleep program?
So that's where that hormone ghrelin just kicks into high gear. That hormone that is just saying, it's a starvation hormone at that point. It's not just a hunger hormone. You've gone over into starvation, and that will promote alertness. It promotes chemicals that try to keep you awake, chemicals like dopamine to sort of force you wide awake.
So it's forcing you to go hunt or gather.
That's right. Yeah.
And this is even if your body goes into a state of ketosis.
That we don't know. People have not tried to correlate sort of the profile change in ketosis versus alterations in sleep. I actually think it would be fascinating. Maybe there's a peak where it's bad, and then you crest it, and then things get better. Does the body acclimate to that? I don't know. It's
Yo, guys, I think I just invented a new motorsport.
You have?
Yep, it's like drag racing, you see. Except at the end of the quarter mile, there's the jump. Whoever lands farthest wins.
By the way,
What do
people
you
should
call
know that
it?
after 20
I'm glad
hours
you
of
asked.
being awake,
You
are
ready?
as impaired
Oh, God.
cognitively as you would
Dragonfly.
be if you were legally drunk.
Wow. What about physical movement?
Same thing, yeah, in
Really?
terms of your alertness and reaction time. But it's worse, and this is where drowsy driving comes in. For every 30 seconds that we've been speaking, there has been a car accident linked to sleeplessness. Drowsy driving, it seems, kills more people on the roads than either alcohol or drugs combined.
Whoa.
Why are drowsy driving accidents so deathly? Now, I'm not endorsing those other things, of course not, but let's just think about why that's the case. When you're underslept, you start to have what are called micro sleeps. Sometimes your eyelid does not close all the way, it just partially closes, but the brain essentially goes to sleep for just a very brief period of time. And you can even see individual brain cells, looks like they go to sleep during these micro sleeps. At that moment, if you're traveling in a vehicle on the freeway, you've got a 1-ton missile traveling at 65 miles an hour and no one is in control.
1 ton if you're lucky.
Yeah,
When
exactly.
was the last time you saw a 2,000-pound car, unless you have a Miata?
Or a McLaren P1. But if you are,
Even those are heavier than that.
are they really?
Yeah.
Shows my lack of knowledge despite living them. I think, and what happens here is that with drugs and alcohol, it's often the case of a problem of later reaction. With a lack of sleep, it's a problem of no reaction at all.
So you're out of it.
So you're out of it. So rather than breaking too late, there's just no breaking whatsoever.
Yeah,
That's
I have
why.
a tip for people too. If you find yourself cold or tired and driving and you have to stay awake, take either ice or ice cold water and put it in a washcloth, and then rub your face with it. Keeps you awake.
It works.
Yeah, it works. I mean, if you're forced to drive for whatever reason, you have 20 minutes to go and you're really exhausted, do that. Ice is the best. Take a wet cloth, put ice inside of it, and just rub your face. It just wakes you right up for whatever reason.
And the statistics around drowsy driving though, are frightening. And
It's a weird thing when you're on the road. There's something about those white lines that just want to put you to sleep. There's no other time where I feel more compelled to just conk out while I'm awake.
yeah, it's probably one of the greatest sedatives known to
Yeah,
man.
it's strange.
If that monotonous, behavior, and the longer you go with that monotony, the worse things get. You know, and if you look at you know, teenagers, that's where we see some of the greatest impact of drowsy driving. You know, it's the leading cause of death in most first world nations. Suicide is second.
Wow, that is crazy.
And it speaks to this, you know, in this model of later school start times. They've done these studies. There was a great one that was done, I think, in Teton County in Wyoming. They shifted their school start times from 7:35 in the morning to 8:55 in the morning. Much more biologically reasonable for teenagers. The only thing more impressive than the extra hour of sleep that those teenagers reported getting was the drop in vehicle accidents. There was a 70% reduction in car crashes the following year when they made that time. 7-0.
Holy
so
shit.
The advent of ABS technology, for example, anti-lock brake systems, that dropped accident rates by 20 to 25%. Some deemed it to be a revolution. Here is a simple
Afternoon
biological
heat
fact.
ain't for the faint of
Sleep
heart.
that will drop accident rates by 70%. So I think if our goal as educators truly is to educate, and we've spoken about learning and memory, and not risk lives in the process, then we are failing our children in the most spectacular manner with this incessant model of early school start times.
Why do we do that? Like what? And not just early school times, but early work times too. I was driving to the airport the other day at 6 a.m. 6 a.m. bumper to bumper traffic on the 405. I was like, this is insane. Look at these poor fucks.
What are we doing? And if you're in the car at 6 a.m. there, it means that you probably woke up, you know, 4. You know,
4:30.
You know, average school start times, you know, in the US, some of them, you know, 7:25. Buses for a school start time of 7:25 will begin leaving at 5:30 in the morning. That means that some kids are having to wake up at 5:15, 5 o'clock, maybe even earlier. This is lunacy.
It is lunacy. Now, why do they do that? I mean, it's just a pattern that they've always done, and they never corrected it.
Yeah, it's a pattern that actually has changed over the past 30 or 40 years. American schools used to start around 9 o'clock, and it started to shift ever and ever earlier.
Why?
Part of it is because of work times, that parents had to get to work at ever earlier
So they drop
start
the kids
times.
off
So you
before
drop the kid, and then bus unions and bus schools, they comply to that same time frame as well, and it becomes very difficult. You know, and I don't mean to chastise school systems or the bus unions. You know, it's an incredibly difficult logistics problem. But I have to think that, you know, what is our goal here? Our goal is to keep our kids safe and to get them well educated and get information into the brain and nurture them, you know, create them to be the next generation. Early school start times, you know, are not the thing to do.
There's a lot of lazy kids out there that are going, yes!
Yeah, well,
Preach on, doctor, preach!
I mean, the data, you know, they looked at these academic things too. You know, one of these, another example comes from school start times average SAT score of 1,288, which is a great score. The following year, when they were going to school now at 8:30 rather than 7:25, the average SAT score was 1,500. That's a 212-point increase, which is non-trivial.
Wow. That's yeah, I think it's the school time in correlation with the work time.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to get people off of that.
Yeah, and that's part and also commuting for longer durations of time. So therefore people having to wake up earlier, they come home later, and the one thing that gets squeezed.
It's time to win this. Clean corners and you've got this. I got this. Another win.
6 hours and 31 minutes for the average adult during the week in America. That's the average, by the way. That means that there's a huge swath of people well below that average.
And what about the people that say that they sleep, they go to bed, they sleep 5 hours, they wake up and they feel great?
Yeah.
Is that bullshit?
We have the number of people who can survive on 6 hours of sleep or less without showing any impairment, rounded to a whole number and expressed as a percent of the population is 0.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, 0.
And one of the big problems with a lack of sleep, by the way, is that you don't know you're sleep deprived when you're sleep deprived. So your subjective sense of how well you're doing with a lack of sleep is a miserable predictor of objectively how you're doing. So it's
especially
like a drunk
with
driver.
men, right?
Yeah,
right.
Especially, perfect example. You know, you're at the bar, you've had 6 or 7 shots, and you say, I can drive home, I'm fine. And your response is, I know that you think you're fine to drive subjectively, objectively, trust me, you're not. It's the same way with sleep deprivation.
That's fascinating. So, but you're not drunk, so even though you're impaired, you don't feel like you're impaired, and you probably have a couple of espressos or
they end up taking the simpler ones, like listening to voice messages, rather than actually digging into deep project work. They produce fewer creative solutions to challenges that you give them. They also slack off when they're working in groups. It's called social loafing, where they just ride the coattails of other people's hard work. The less that they do, don't pull your weight. Furthermore, it goes all the way up to the top. So the more or less sleep that a business leader has had from one night to the next, the more or less charismatic their employees will rate that business leader. Of that CEO, it's evident in their behavior.
Well, because they're short with the, they're short with their temper.
Yep.
They're quicker to get upset about things. They're less charismatic and social with their conversations.
Yep.
They're just more, okay, I got it.
Yeah.
Go to work.
Work for it.
Yeah.
So less sleep does not equal more productivity. And it's always struck me as strange, why do we sort of overvalue employees that undervalue sleep? And if you look at your workforce, trust me, everyone's going to be looking busy, but it's like stationary bikes. Everyone's looking like they're working hard, but there's no forward progress. The scenery never changes. That's what an underslept workforce will be for you.
Now, what about the amount of time that people spend at work? I mean, I know this is not related to sleep, but I've always felt like people work too much. I feel like you probably get more done with less time there.
Yeah, so efficiency is what we're talking about here, and that's another one of those things with sleep deprivation. And I think many people, when they haven't had a good night of sleep, they're looking at this report and they realize, I've just read this paragraph the third time and I still can't quite get it.
Because your head's scrambled. Yeah.
Efficiency, productivity.
But I would feel like when people are working 8 hours a day, I don't think that you could work at peak capacity for 8 hours. At least I don't think the average person can.
No, you can't sustain that.
Yeah. So you're kind of bleeding these people. You're getting blood out of a rock in the last couple hours.
And it's not, either a creative way to work, and creativity, is supposed to be the engine of, business and an ingenuity. But why would you, take twice the amount of time to boil a pot of water on half heat when you could do it in half the time if you just put it on high? Well, that's sleep.
You know what's interesting, though? There are certain writers who use sleep deprivation as a strategy for creativity. They literally don't start, like the writers for a sitcom I was on, News Radio, they wouldn't start writing until like 2, 3 in the morning. They would just play video games and fuck around, and then late at night they would really start writing, and they would write till like 7 in the morning. They would stumble into the set like barefoot, delirious, hair all fucked up with hilarious scripts. And it's like they had used
But what we have found, at least in our scientific studies, is that prefrontal cortex, rational, logical part of the brain, that's one of the first things to go when you're sleep deprived. So that area of the brain just gets sort of switched off.
Right.
The more that you are sort of lacking in your sleep, and deep emotional centers of the brain, which are normally controlled and kept in check by that prefrontal cortex, they just erupt in terms of their activity. So you're all emotional gas pedal and too little regulatory controlled brains, which for the most part, very bad. But, one possibility is that if you want to try and get a little bit sort of, crazy, loosey-goosey, maybe that's not bad for that type of sort of comedic writing, that you become a bit more childlike. And I say that affectionately because the last part of the brain to mature in development is the prefrontal cortex. So you revert back to almost a more childlike state. But I honestly would not condone that sort of, undergoing sleep, just based on the mortality and, risk of Alzheimer's and cancer by itself. You just don't want to undersleep.
Even in short doses, like a couple days a week, like here's the, if sleep is not a renewable resource, like what is the effect of, say, if you have 3 nights a week where you sleep 8 hours, and then the next night 2 hours, and then the next night 8 hours, how much of a bump or how much of a dip does that 2 hours give you in your overall health?
It's bad.
It's bad.
So I'll give you 2 examples. There was a study where they just took individuals and they just gave them 4 hours of sleep for one night, what they saw was a 70% reduction in critical anti-cancer fighting immune cells called natural killer cells. These are wonderful immune assassins that target malignant cells. So today, both you and I have produced cancer cells in our body. What prevents those cancer cells from becoming the disease that we call cancer is in part these natural killer cells. And after one night of 4 hours of sleep, that is a remarkable state of immune deficiency, and that's one of the reasons why insufficient sleep predicts cancer. I could also speak about your cardiovascular system though, and all it takes is 1 hour. Because there is a global experiment that's performed on 1.6 billion people across 70 countries twice a year, and it's called daylight savings time. Now, in the spring, when we lose an hour of sleep, we see a subsequent 24% increase in heart attacks.
What?
In the fall, in the autumn, when we gain an hour of sleep, there's a 21% decrease in heart attacks. So it's bidirectional.
Wow.
That's how fragile and vulnerable your body is to even just the smallest perturbation of sleep.
1 hour.
1 hour is
That's
all it takes.
insane.
Yeah.
Wow. That is, you're blowing my fucking mind.
It's frightening. I mean, you can go even further, by the way. You know,
wow.
insufficient sleep will even erode the very fabric of biological life itself, your DNA code. So in one study, they took a group of healthy adults and they limited them to 6 hours of sleep. And they compared the profile of gene activity relative to when those same people were getting 8 hours of sleep. And there were two critical results. The first was that a sizable 711 genes were distorted in their activity, caused by 1 week of 6 hours of sleep. Which is highly relevant, by the way, because we know that many people are trying to survive on 6 hours of sleep during the week.
Wow.
The second, sorry.
No, please go.
I was going to say the second sort of perhaps more interesting result was that about half of those genes were actually increased in their activity. The other half were actually suppressed. Those genes that were switched off by 6 hours of sleep for 1 week were genes related to your immune response, many of them. So you become immune deficient. Those genes that were increased, or what we call overexpressed, were genes that were related to the promotion of tumors, genes that were related to
what's really disturbing to me in my youth from
Private Jack.
I delivered newspapers. Drive around. I might have been 17 whenever I started driving. I drove at 16, but I don't think I started right away delivering newspapers, but I was trying to find a good part-time job. I think I was like either in my senior year of high school or after. I think right after my senior year of high school, so I was probably 18.
Okay, and the reason I asked, by the way, is because as you go through into those sort of later stages of adolescence and sort of early adulthood, your biological rhythm moves forward in time. So you want to go to bed later and wake up later.
Yeah.
So even if you went to bed sort of conscientiously at that time, let's say like 10 o'clock or 9 o'clock, you wouldn't be able to sleep because it's biologically impossible.
Yeah, no, I didn't sleep. And
Yeah.
then on Saturday, even worse, one day a week, Saturday night, I'd have to get up at 3 or 4 in the morning because I had to deliver Sunday papers, and the Sunday papers were enormous. And so I had to pack a van filled with, because I had 350 people that I would deliver papers to, so I'd have to do multiple trips. So I'd start work at, I'd start delivering somewhere around 4:35, depending on when the papers got in, and I was done by like 9, 9:30, and then I'd try to crash, but I was a wreck.
Yeah.
I mean, and it fucked me up for years. For years I did that. And I stop and think about that now. Listening to you, listening to this conversation, like, what kind of fucking damage did I do to myself over those years?
Yeah, I'll tell you about the stuff with Alzheimer's.
Well, I feel okay now. It's been several decades.
Did I mention that your subjective sense of how well you're doing with insufficient sleep is no?
Wow, I'm sure you did, and I'm sure that there's a factor there. What's stunning to me is that 6 hours is so detrimental. I would have thought that would have been fine. 6 hours is good. Like, you get 6 hours, that's good. That's normal for me.
Yeah.
Like, 6 hours is normal. Literally, the minimum is 7.
Yeah, 7 to 9 hours of sleep.
7 you need.
Yeah.
Anything under 7 is bullshit.
Yeah. For the average
Really
dog.
should get 8.
There is a small fraction of 1% of the population that has a special gene that allows them to survive on about 5 hours of sleep. And most people, when I tell them this, they say, I
must
think
have that.
I'm one of those people.
Yeah.
The chances of you being, you're much more likely, for example, to be struck by lightning in your lifetime, the odds of which are, I think, about 1 in 12,500, than you are to have this incredibly rare gene that means you can survive on something around 5 hours of sleep.
Really?
Yeah.
So what is the gene?
Well, it's a gene that seems to promote sort of, again, wakefulness chemistry within the brain that allows you to sort of maintain wakefulness in a more sustained way. And so we're only trying to understand right now what the actual biochemical mechanisms are in terms of the consequence of that gene mutation. But certainly it seems to exist that there are some of those quote-unquote short sleepers. By the way, we hear of these business leaders and even actually heads of state, I'm not going to name names, but I'll give you right now. But I'll give you 2 examples of the past. Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan both were vociferous in their statement and their declaration of how little sleep that they would get. Both of them said 4 or 5 hours a night. And I think in part it was to paint this heroic ironclad status.
Yeah.
And many people would say to me, Margaret Thatcher, lifetime. Well, sadly and tragically, Thatcher and Reagan both ended up getting Alzheimer's disease, and we now know because of during deep sleep at night that there is a sewage system in the brain that kicks into high gear and it cleanses the brain of all of the metabolic toxins that have been built up throughout the day, this low-level brain damage. One of those toxic sticky proteins that built up whilst we're awake is called beta amyloid. Beta amyloid is one of the leading causes of underlying the mechanism of Alzheimer's disease. So the less sleep that you're having across the lifespan, the more of that toxic amyloid is building up night after night, year after year, and I don't think it's coincidental that both of them ended up progressing tragically into a state of Alzheimer's disease. So it's good night, sleep clean in that way in terms of deep sleep.
That's
critical.
Stunning. That is stunning. Are there any
over the basic reduction in your alertness, so basic response times. You can dose with caffeine and still maintain some degree of a fast response under conditions of sleep deprivation.
What about Provigil or Nuvigil? Have you studied that?
Yeah, so modafinil is the underlying chemical there, and it's debated who actually came up with it. It may have been the French military who actually the generator. Dopamine is principally known as pleasure drug. It's the chemical that a lot of so it's Things is that if you look at the profile of what sleep deprivation is cognitively, reduced alertness, impulsivity, lack of ability to concentrate, difficulties with learning and memory, difficulties with behavioral problems. If I were to describe those features to a pediatrician and say, what disorder is this? I'd probably say it's ADHD.
Yes.
But what we now know is that there is some portion of children out there who are diagnosed with ADHD who either, one, are just underslept, or two, actually have sleep disordered breathing because of perhaps tonsil problems where they're not getting sufficient sleep. And when you treat their sleep disorder, when you do sort of, remove the tonsils, they start sleeping normally and the ADHD disappears.
Wow.
So there is an issue here, I think, within that sort of the explosion of ADHD. Not all people are, sort of privy to this sort of sleep problem simply masquerading as ADHD, but some people are. One of the other problems too, though, is that ADHD kids tend not to sleep very well. And what we end up giving them is a drug that is a stimulant which will combat sleep and fight back against sleep. So I think we need to have a bit more of a strategic approach as to when we think about at least the dose of that medication in terms of when sleep should be sort of expected during the day. Because, taking it in the middle of the day, in the evening, if it's a stimulant, it's a wake-promoting drug, you need to be very careful. Sleep is part of that.
Well, that's terrifying, because I don't know if the people that are prescribing these things have the sort of deep education in sleep and the necessity of it that you do.
They don't, and it's not their fault either. And in fact, I've started to try and lobby doctors to start prescribing sleep. And don't make the mistake that that's me suggesting, prescribing sleeping pills. That's a separate story. Sleeping pills are associated with significantly higher risk of death and cancer, and I'm happy to speak about that too. There's the one chapter in the book that I think the legal team of my publisher took a very long look at. But I think doctors, to come back to your point, they on average only have about 2 hours of sleep education in the medical curriculum. So 1/3
2 hours.
2 hours. 1/3 of their...
This podcast has been 2 hours.
Yeah,
that's fucking crazy. So
isn't that frightening?
That's terrifying, and I bet you probably have laid things out better in this podcast than you would get in those 2 hours of education.
I don't know about that, but
I'll give you that credit.
If they could increase that, I'm desperately appealing for this. It's 1/3 of their patient's life, but they only get 2 hours of education. But the other problem is the medical industry itself, by the way. Their residents, that data, junior residents working a 30-hour shift are 460% more likely to make diagnostic errors in the intensive care unit relative to when they're working 16 hours. If you have elective surgery, you should ask your surgeon how much sleep they've had in the past 24 hours. If they've had 6 hours of sleep or less, you have a 170% increased risk of a major surgical error, such as sort of organ damage or hemorrhaging, relative to that same surgeon if they had been well rested. And then the irony here, by the way, is that when a resident finishes a 30-hour shift, gets back into their car to drive home, there is a 168% increased risk that they will get into a car accident because of their underslept state, ending up back in the same emergency room where they just came from, but now as a patient from a car crash. We need to radically rethink the importance of sleep in education, in business, in the workplace, and in medicine too.
Why do they do that to residents?
It's a fascinating story. So there's a chapter here in the book on this too. It's a guy called William Halstead, and he set up the first resident surgical program in the United States at Johns Hopkins University. And he was known for being able to stay awake for these heroic lengths of time, days on end. It was this incredible, superhuman strength. Turns out that in later years after he died, there was a dirty secret, that he was actually a cocaine addict.
That son of a bitch.
And here's what happened. It wasn't his fault. Early in his career, he was examining the anesthetic capacities of cocaine. So, well, I'm not going to say, you may have heard from perhaps colleagues that when you snort cocaine, you get a numb face. the reason is because it blocks nerves.
I like how you said from colleagues. My colleagues have told me. I've actually never done cocaine, but I know quite a few people who have.
And they will, they'll have this sort of numbness. It's the reason is because cocaine is also a nerve blocking agent.
Yeah, like lidocaine.
Lidocaine, exactly.
We talked about this yesterday, ironically, on the podcast, and about doctors becoming drug addicts. The initial doctors that started doing lidocaine.
Halstead was one of them.
Yes,
and
that's
so
right.
he became an accidental cocaine addict.
Wow.
And then
so that's why he was up for days.
He was up for days. The story was that he actually knew that he went to a hypnotician, and one part of
Go, go, go!
box that we were otherwise. Why do we accept treatment after 20 hours of being so unfortunately we place young residents in
This is the voice of the street. I'm your curator.
Not even close, Mac.
Who is the curator, do you think?
No idea. He sure knows his Fortune Valley.
God, bugging me so much.
Morning deaths?
And they are literally numerous and soon to maybe at the stage where it's my mind is made up, don't confuse me with the facts.
Wow. This is blowing me away. I just don't understand how the very people that are working on the health of patients and fixing them and repairing injuries and taking care of diseases, those are the people that are ignoring one of the primary factors of disease and errors and cognitive function.
It's
impairment.
It's a travesty.
I have a friend who's an ophthalmologist, and he tells a story about during his residency, this is back in the 80s, and he had a pager. He was on the toilet with a